It took just 14 seconds. 14 seconds for a single sentence, whispered when the cameras were supposed to be off, to spiral across the internet, the news, and into living rooms across America. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert didn't know her mic was still live, but when she leaned over and said what she really thought about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she set fire to something far bigger than politics. Inside that Capitol hearing room, with C-SPAN still rolling and every seat filled, it wasn't the shouting that stunned the nation. It was the silence that followed. Because when AOC heard the recording, she didn't explode. She didn't storm out. She simply stood up, looked around the room, and gave the kind of response that doesn't go viral for being loud, but for being right. And as you watch what happened next, ask yourself, what kind of country are we? When a woman gets caught, not for lying, but for finally telling the truth she thought no one else would hear. This is a dramatized story inspired by public figures and real political tensions. But the events, characters, and dialogue are fictional. Still, the emotions, the questions, those are real, because sometimes a fictional mic stays on, just long enough for all of us to hear what's really being said. Marble columns frame the congressional hearing chamber like a stage set for something historic or explosive. The walls, usually lifeless and beige, seem to pulse with the breath of 100 bodies packed too tightly into a space too small for the tension it would hold. It was 9:02 a.m., and the hearing on immigration and border security had not yet begun, but the drama already had. Reporters lined the back wall, some cradling notepads, others whispering into tiny microphones, and one or two just watching, eyes sharpened by the unmistakable scent of a headline in the air. Cameramen adjusted their focus not on the witness table, but on the empty seats reserved for members of Congress. One journalist leaned toward another and whispered, "If Boebert shows up swinging and AOC fires back, this might go viral before lunch." At exactly 9:07, the door swung open with a sharp ceremonial creak. Lauren Boebert entered like a spark in a powder room. She wore a bold red blazer that flared at the waist, paired with black stilettos and a look that dared anyone to question her patriotism. Her smile was sharp, calculated, not for the committee, but for the cameras she knew were rolling. The American flag pin on her lapel gleamed under the chandelier's light, strategically placed, just enough to catch every lens. As she strode past the hearing desk, she made sure her heels clapped loudly against the floor. 2 seconds later, she muttered, just loudly enough to be heard, "Well, I guess I'm the only one on time to protect America." A few reporters chuckled nervously. One turned to another and said under their breath, "That's going in the reel." The chairman hadn't even called the hearing to order when Boebert was already flipping through her notes like a game plan, though no one could see what was on them but big, bold headers and underlines in red ink. And then, at 9:11, the tone of the room shifted. Another door opened, this one softly without spectacle. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped in with no entourage, no theatrics. She wore a navy blue blazer, modest heels, and carried a slim file folder under one arm. No flag pin, no fiery entrance. But her presence drew eyes anyway, not because she demanded it, but because she radiated something quieter, something steadier. Where Boebert looked like she had come to detonate, AOC looked like she had come to dismantle, with data. She took her seat calmly, nodding at the clerk and flipping open her folder. Inside were printed tables, handwritten notes, and 3 color-coded tabs: detention data, legal backlogs, human costs. The contrast between the two women was almost cinematic. Boebert shifted in her seat, clearly aware. She tilted her mic downward but glanced up with a smile meant to sting. "Hope you brought your talking points, Congresswoman." AOC didn't look up. "I brought facts." That was when one of the photographers at the back clicked a burst of shots, not of the committee, not of the chairman, but of them. 2 women, same chamber, same microphone, entirely different weapons. Outside, the line of civilians waiting to enter still curled down the marble staircase. Inside, the lights dimmed slightly as the screens flickered to life. The seal of the United States shimmered faintly behind the panel as the chairman finally reached for his gavel. But in that moment, Before a single word of the hearing was officially spoken, everyone in the room could feel it. Something was about to happen. Not a policy debate, not a partisan clash, something personal. And somewhere in that room, a microphone that wasn't supposed to be on already was. The Committee on Homeland Security and Border Affairs is now in session, the chairman announced, his voice tight and formal. Today's hearing will examine the operational impacts of border security failures and legislative accountability. But before his sentence could even land, Lauren Boebert leaned into her mic like a performer leaning into the spotlight. "Mr. Chairman," she began, eyes sweeping the room as if casting a net. "What we are witnessing at our southern border is not just a crisis, it's a collapse engineered by leftist negligence and open border insanity." A small gasp came from somewhere in the gallery, but Boebert didn't flinch. She thrived in provocation. "Let's be honest. Under this administration, we don't have a border. We have a welcome mat. We have fentanyl pouring in by the truckload, cartels operating like Amazon Prime, and ICE officers being treated like villains instead of heroes. And who's cheering it on? The radical left. People like Miss Ocasio-Cortez, who think empathy means inviting chaos." Cameras zoomed in. A producer in the press box mouthed gold. Boebert continued, slamming down a stapled packet of blurry images. Overcrowded shelters, a grainy photo of what looked like a man in handcuffs, a crying child. "You want visuals? Here. This is what progressive policy looks like. This is what happens when you choose slogans over sovereignty." She paused for effect, letting the words echo. She smiled, slightly satisfied. A few heads in the crowd nodded. Others stiffened. Then a quiet voice. "May I respond, Mr. Chairman?" AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise her eyebrows. But when she leaned into the microphone, the room seemed to adjust itself. Congresswoman Boebert spoke about images. "I'd like to speak about numbers." She opened her folder, sliding out a small stack of neatly printed pages with charts and graphs, lines highlighted in yellow and underlined in blue ink. Since 2019, over 81,000 unaccompanied children have been detained, many for weeks at a time, in privately contracted facilities where oversight is limited and abuse is too often reported but rarely investigated. As of this morning, the Office of Refugee Resettlement reports that 63% of those children still have no reunification timeline. The room held its breath. She flipped the page. In the last fiscal year alone, there were over 1,400 credible fear claims dismissed in under 5 minutes without translation or legal representation. These aren't numbers pulled from a blog. These are from court records filed in this very building. Boebert leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, jaw tight. The red blazer suddenly looked less like fire and more like warning. "And while my colleague calls this empathy," AOC added, "I call it law. U.S. law says we do not punish asylum seekers before their claims are heard. It says we don't detain children in cages. And it certainly doesn't say that tears are a threat to national security." There was no applause, no eruption, just stillness. A kind of intellectual silence that cut deeper than noise. Then Boebert scoffed. "That's not real America," she snapped, voice rising. AOC looked up for the first time. Her eyes met Boebert's, not with anger, but with an unsettling calm. "I represent the Bronx," she said, "and it's as real as it gets." The air in the room shifted. Again. This time it felt colder, sharper, like something invisible had cracked. Boebert's voice grew sharper. "You're defending illegal crossings. You're defending chaos." "No," AOC said, lowering her tone further, almost to a whisper. "I'm defending children and the Constitution." That's when it became clear to everyone in the room, even those who came in expecting nothing but political theater. This wasn't going to be just another headline fodder debate. This was going to be a reckoning. And somewhere under the table, nestled in the electronics of a nameplate, the microphone blinked. Still live. Still listening. The air in the chamber loosened, like a taut rope finally allowed a moment of slack. Staffers stood, whispered, stretched. Reporters darted out to file early leads. A few lobbyists shuffled toward the hallway, phones already to their ears, hungry to feed networks their first soundbites. Lauren Boebert stood abruptly, her heels striking the marble with a click sharper than applause. Her red blazer caught the light again, though this time it didn't glow. It flickered. She didn't wait for the others. With a swift nod to no one in particular, she strode off toward the side corridor, her aide following 2 steps behind. The press still lingered, but her focus was inward now, narrowed to the moment, to the frustration coiling behind her teeth. "That woman," she muttered, voice just above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Always so smug. Always playing the victim card wrapped in a fact sheet." Her aide didn't answer, just kept pace. As they neared the doorway, she exhaled hard and hissed, "I miss the days they just knew their place." 7 words, said in passing, with bitterness, with certainty. The aide's head turned slightly, as if unsure he'd heard right. But Boebert didn't stop. The words had already left her lips, forgotten by the speaker perhaps, but not by the room. Because Boebert's mic was still on. She hadn't flipped the switch. Neither had staff. The small black lapel pin clipped neatly to her blazer was blinking. A pulsing red dot that meant her voice, her breath, her mutters, had been piped into the live feed, archived by C-SPAN, and quietly recorded by multiple streaming backups that no one ever thinks about until it's too late. Inside the chamber, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained seated. She hadn't left the dais. Her eyes were fixed on a set of handwritten notes. Unbothered, unmoved, unaware. The chair beside her, Boebert's seat, now stood empty, its microphone arm still extended, its nameplate still glowing with a soft digital white. From the far side of the room, a camera operator zoomed in, not on anyone speaking, not on the committee chair, but on that empty chair. There was something haunting about it, a symbol, perhaps, of absence, or something worse, presence gone wrong. The chamber's noise grew louder. Conversations overlapped. Pages flipped. Laptops closed. But a single audio channel, isolated and uninterrupted, continued recording everything. "I miss the days they just knew their place." The sentence hadn't landed yet. No one had reacted. No phones buzzed. No tweets broke through. Not yet. In the corner of the press row, a junior sound technician watched the waveform pulse on his screen and narrowed his eyes. He clicked his headset. "Channel 3's still hot." "What?" the lead producer asked, half listening. "Boebert's mic. It's still hot. She just said..." He froze, rewound, played it again. And there it was. The room itself didn't feel different, yet. The carpet still muffled footsteps. The chandelier light still buzzed faintly. But something had shifted, like a low tide drawing back before a wave breaks. No one inside the room knew. No one watching the feed at that moment caught it. But somewhere, in a booth behind a monitor, in the corner of a tweet storm waiting to ignite, the match had been struck. Back in the corridor, Boebert disappeared around the bend, still speaking in hushed tones, still unaware. And inside the chamber, AOC looked up for just a second, toward the press box, then back down to her notes. He sipped lukewarm coffee, scanned the waveform timelines, and labeled folders by date and committee title. Homeland Security, May 11th Border Policy Hearing. Nothing seemed out of place, until he saw something strange. One of the audio tracks, Channel 3 labeled Boebert, continued running 72 seconds longer than the official adjournment marker. That wasn't standard. The mics were supposed to cut the moment the chairman gavelled the recess. Curious, he dragged the scrub bar forward, then back, listening for anything unusual. At first, just the usual rustle, papers, footsteps, chairs. Then a voice, sharp, familiar. "I miss the days they just knew their place." Jalen froze. He played it again, slower, same voice, same words, same heat. He didn't say anything for a moment. His hands hovered above the keyboard. 1,000 thoughts raced. Was this serious? Was it real? Was he even allowed to react? Protocol told him to clip it, move on, but his gut said, save it, and his gut was right. That night, while D.C. glittered with embassy galas and power dinners, a different kind of story began its climb through the internet's underbrush. It started not with CNN, not with Fox, not even Politico. It started with a YouTuber named The District Snoop, a mid-tier commentator known more for snarky political compilations than investigative reporting. He ran a 30,000 subscriber channel filled with thumbnails like Rand Paul loses it on Fauci again, and Kamala's laugh breaks the room. Scrolling through C-SPAN's raw uploads for new material, he noticed the unusually long file and clicked through, half watching, half scrolling his phone, until the moment hit him like a slap. He sat up, rewound, cranked the volume, rewound again. Then he laughed, but not with humor, with disbelief. "Did she just say that?" he muttered aloud. It became the title of the upload. "Did she just say that?" Lauren Boebert's Mic Stays On, raw audio. He posted it at 10:48 p.m. Eastern. It had 78 views in the first 5 minutes. Then someone dropped it in a progressive Reddit thread titled "Congresswoman or Segregationist?" That's when the fire caught. By midnight, it had 12,000 views. By 2 a.m., hashtag #MixStillOn was trending nationwide on Twitter. By sunrise, it had leapt from fringe YouTube to progressive blogs like Crooked Media, The Recount, and The Young Turks. The clip made it into a reaction TikTok with a side-by-side caption. "This woman sits on the Homeland Security Committee." And by 8:04 a.m., MSNBC's Morning Joe opened with it cold. No music, no intro. Just Boebert's voice crackling from the mic feed. "I miss the days they just knew their place." And silence, followed by the anchor's line. That, ladies and gentlemen, was not said in the 1960s. That was said yesterday. Back in the C-SPAN tech office, Jalen sat at his desk watching the clip spread like ink and water. His supervisor hadn't called him. Yet. But his inbox had 4 messages, flagged urgent. And his phone was buzzing every few minutes with texts that started with, "Yo, bro, was that you?" He didn't answer. He just watched. Somewhere in the swell of tweets, shares, and outraged commentary, one voice posted simply, "If this doesn't define where we are as a country in one sentence, I don't know what does." And just like that, a moment meant to be forgotten, mumbled, careless, unguarded, had become the center of the American conversation. The mic had stayed on. And now so was the country. The hashtag #MixStillOn wasn't just trending, it was roaring. It began on political Twitter, moved through TikTok, bounced to Instagram Reels, and landed in morning newsletters. It wasn't just politics junkies anymore. Suburban moms, veterans forums, church group chats, they were all buzzing. Lauren Boebert's name had been tweeted over 210,000 times by 9:30 a.m. Not because of a bill, not because of a speech, but because of 7 words she never meant for anyone to hear. Her voice, grainy, stripped of polish, played on loop. "I miss the days they just knew their place." It was clipped, captioned, slowed down, spliced into montages, even auto-tuned. One TikTok creator laid the quote over black and white footage from the 1950s. Segregated buses, silent protests, the Little Rock Nine. The caption read, "History doesn't repeat, it just finds new microphones." By 10 a.m., the Daily Beast had released a timeline of the clip's discovery. By 10:15, Snopes had already received over 1,200 user requests asking, "Is this fake?" The answer came quickly. 3 prominent audio forensics labs, including Audionetics, which had worked on high-profile FBI and DOJ cases, released statements. This audio file shows no evidence of manipulation or splicing. The voice print and environmental acoustics match confirmed recordings of Congresswoman Lauren Boebert. This is authentic. But that didn't stop her team from pushing back. At 10:47 a.m., Boebert's press secretary posted on X, "This is a malicious fake engineered by radical operatives who can't win in real debates. We've alerted legal counsel. The Congresswoman stands by her record." The post included the phrase digitally altered deepfake, which ignited its own firestorm. Audio engineers, tech-savvy Gen Z activists, even retired news anchors jumped in, dismantling the claim point by point. A deepfake? Please, this isn't Marvel. It's a live mic and a live mouth. That's not AI, that's just I. If it was fake, why is she hiding? Cable networks scrambled to catch up. Fox News, unusually quiet for their usual rapid response, hedged their bets. Morning anchors avoided the phrase altogether. By noon, only one short chyron ran. Boebert, audio under scrutiny. Context missing? But over on MSNBC, the fire blazed hotter. Joy Reid opened her 11 a.m. segment like it was breaking news. We don't need context. We don't need speculation. We need courage. Because when a sitting congresswoman says something straight out of 1962 and then calls it fake, that's not politics. That's cowardice. The clip was replayed 5 times during her hour. Once in real time, once slowed, once over a split-screen image of Boebert at a rally next to AOC questioning ice conditions, once with subtitles, and once without a word, just the quote and the flag waving in the background. Meanwhile, AOC said nothing. She had posted nothing. Not a tweet, not a quote, not a single retweet. And in her silence, the speculation grew. She's planning something. She's letting the country hear it for itself. She doesn't need to speak. Boebert already did. In the afternoon press briefing, a CNN reporter asked White House Press Secretary Marisol Hayes whether the president had seen the clip. Hayes offered a diplomatic response, then paused. "Let me just say this," she added, tone firmer. "When a microphone catches what someone really believes, it's not the mic's fault. It's the mirror being held up, and it's time we start looking into it." Even some conservative voices blinked. A syndicated radio host in Ohio, long considered a Boebert defender, admitted, "It's not the kind of thing you can walk back. Not when people heard it raw. Not when it sounds like something their grandparents fought against." That evening, the New York Times featured a headline in bold black ink: "Hot mic, cold words, the 7 seconds that shook the Hill." And in a tucked corner of Capitol Hill, behind a closed office door, a congresswoman known for volume sat in uncharacteristic silence, watching the clip on mute, again and again. The mic had stayed on, but this time the country had started to listen. But inside the office there was stillness. Her staff had locked the door hours earlier, not from fear, but to give her space. Space to think, to breathe, to plan. Through the frosted glass, the faint outlines of aides could be seen intercepting questions, offering firm but polite replies. "She's reviewing committee materials. Will issue a statement when appropriate. Please respect the Congresswoman's schedule." But the reporters didn't budge. From CNN to BuzzFeed, from the Washington Post to YouTube podcasters with DSLRs hanging from their necks, they all waited, lenses trained like searchlights, ready to record the first crack in her silence. Twitter buzzed with countdowns. She has to say something. She can't let this go. This is her moment. And then the door opened. Not dramatically, not in a way meant for cameras, just a gentle click, a quiet swing. AOC stepped out, alone. She wore no makeup beyond foundation, no statement blazer, just a black turtleneck and navy slacks. In her hand was a manila folder, its edges curled from hours of being gripped, not read. A dozen voices rose at once. Microphones pushed forward. Flashes burst. "Congresswoman, your response to the Boebert clip? Do you believe she should resign? Are you planning to address this on the House floor? Do you think this reveals systemic racism in Congress?" AOC held up one hand, not to shush them, just to hold the moment. Then, in the silence that fell between camera shutters and held breath, she said it, softly, evenly, as if speaking to one person in a quiet room. "When the time comes, I'll speak, and I won't need to raise my voice." That was it. One sentence. No press conference. No outrage. Just clarity. She walked down the hallway, not hurried, but not lingering. She did not look back. Her staff followed, forming a natural barrier between her and the wall of microphones. And behind them, the silence she left behind vibrated louder than any soundbite. Within minutes, the quote was everywhere. One photo captured it perfectly. AOC mid-stride, profile half lit by the camera flashes, lips just closing after the final syllable. Underneath the quote in white text, all caps, "I won't need to raise my voice." It was on Instagram stories, Reddit threads, TikTok reactions, MSNBC banners, and even stitched into a ballad on Twitter's new audio feature. Some called it Grace Under Fire. Others said it was a masterclass in restraint, but everyone agreed it was powerful. Boebert's camp mocked it, tweeting out a gif of a mime captioned, "Leadership by silence?" But the mockery fell flat. The tone had shifted. AOC hadn't just refused to play the game, she'd rewritten the rules. Late that night, as the clip continued to surge, an editorial in The Atlantic observed, "Sometimes in politics, the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. Silence is not weakness, silence is control." And in homes across the country, some red, some blue, many gray, people watched the clip again. A woman not shouting, not flinching, not reacting, but choosing her moment, holding the line, letting others drown in their own noise. She hadn't delivered a speech, she had delivered a presence. And in a political culture addicted to shouting, that presence echoed like thunder. The mic had stayed on, but AOC had chosen her silence, and in doing so, she had said more than anyone else that day. Emails from donors sat unopened. Missed calls from party leaders flashed on her phone. Her chief of staff stood waiting with a grim expression, holding a printed copy of the New York Times article with her quote circled in red ink, twice. The morning staff meeting, typically filled with policy updates and regional appearances, devolved into chaos. A junior aide muttered something about the tweet count. Another whispered that several Republican colleagues had declined to appear on Fox alongside her. Outside, a C-SPAN camera had been stationed permanently near her office, and every time the door creaked, reporters perked up like predators at the edge of the forest. Inside the GOP, cracks were forming, fast. Some of the hardliners doubled down. Congressman Reeves from Texas tweeted, "Mike or no Mike, at Lauren Boebert speaks for millions of Americans sick of identity politics." Senator Whitmore offered a softball excuse on talk radio. "I'm sure she was referring to decorum, not race. This is all being blown out of proportion." But others stayed quiet. Too quiet. Veteran Republican Senator Cassidy, known for his centrist tone, told reporters, "I think the Congresswoman should clarify her remarks. Words matter, especially when the country is listening." Even House Majority Leader Benton, who had campaigned with Boebert just 6 months prior, offered only, "No comment at this time." Behind closed doors, the party's media advisors were livid. Fundraisers pulled back email blasts. Think tanks paused upcoming panels. A Republican pollster appeared on cable news and admitted, off script, "We're seeing a serious dip among older independents. This one's not going away." And outside the Beltway, things were boiling. Civil rights groups issued a joint statement by mid-afternoon calling for a formal censure. The NAACP, Urban League, and ACLU all signed on, alongside over 24 state-level advocacy organizations. Their language was pointed. When a sitting Congresswoman publicly mourns a time when people knew their place, she is not just echoing racism, she is inviting it back into our laws. Silence from leadership is complicity. Cable networks replayed that quote alongside images from the civil rights era, marches, dogs, water hoses, and Boebert's blurred profile speaking into her lapel mic. The visual comparison was devastating. And then, just when the moment demanded humility, or at least strategic retreat, Boebert made her move. At 4:17 p.m., her official Twitter account posted a GIF. It showed an old-school mime zipping his lips shut with a giant metal zipper, followed by cartoon text, "Should I be quiet now? Nah." The caption underneath read, "Triggered much?" The post hit like kerosene on a wildfire. Replies flooded in within seconds. One verified user wrote, "This isn't defiance, it's disgrace." Another posted side-by-side screenshots, her GIF next to AOC's calm, steady quote, "When the time comes, I'll speak, and I won't need to raise my voice." The contrast was brutal, and it spread like virus. Within 15 minutes, "Triggered much?" had been quoted in The Atlantic, dissected by Pod Save America, and turned into a literal boomerang meme where the zippered mime's lips kept unzipping on loop. Boebert's staff tried to explain it as humor. Congresswoman Boebert uses satire to cut through media spin. But no one was laughing. Instead, calls for accountability intensified. Faith leaders spoke out. A Baptist pastor from Georgia posted a video saying, "When public servants mock repentance and weaponize arrogance, we lose more than votes." we lose our soul. His sermon got shared by a retired Air Force general. Meanwhile, in a quiet office across the hall, AOC remained silent. Her team monitored the storm but offered no fuel, because they didn't have to. Boebert was unraveling in real time, and for the first time in her political career, the volume wasn't helping. In fact, it was burying her. The mailroom downstairs had resorted to stacking padded envelopes and manila letters in 2 rolling crates labeled NY14. Her senior aide, Mia, sorted them by hand, sifting through thick paper stock, fountain pen cursive, shaky block letters, and even a few that arrived typed on antique typewriters with fading ink. The smell of envelopes, some perfumed, some musty with age, hung in the air like incense in a chapel. It had started with a trickle, a few emails, a handful of handwritten notes from Bronx high schools. But by Wednesday, it was a flood. There were letters from Florida retirees, from farm towns in Indiana, from first-generation immigrants in California, from veterans' homes in Pennsylvania. Some were harsh, dismissive, furious. You people always play the victim. Others were condescending. Stay in your lane, little girl. But most were different. They were slower, softer, thoughtful in a way social media never could be. One came on yellowed stationery, its corners soft with time. The handwriting was stiff, deliberate, like every word had been wrestled onto the page. It was addressed simply, to the Congresswoman who didn't shout back. My name is Harold. I'm 75 years old. I served this country in Nam, came home to a different kind of war, and spent the next 4 decades watching politics become theater. But I never expected to hear that kind of talk again. Not from a Congresswoman. Not in 2024. When she said those words, it broke something in me I thought was long buried. I wanted to scream. I wanted someone to scream. But you didn't. You held your peace. And that silence, it hit harder than any speech. Thank you for not lowering yourself. Thank you for showing my granddaughter that dignity still exists in that chamber. Keep holding your line. We've got your back. Harold L. Parker, Sergeant Rhett, 3rd Infantry, Alabama. AOC read the letter twice, once as a public servant and once as a woman. She didn't cry, not yet, but something inside her shifted, just slightly. More letters came that afternoon. A teenage girl in Detroit who wrote, "My teacher played your clip. I didn't know you could be quiet and powerful at the same time." A mother in Nevada, "My son is nonverbal. What you did showed him that silence isn't weakness, it's strength." Each note felt like a hand on her shoulder, anchoring her. She'd spent years preparing for policy battles, for filibusters, for talking points. But this was different. This was deeper. This was the moment when the public didn't just watch, they witnessed. Her communications director asked gently if she wanted to release a video response now that support was building. She shook her head. Not yet. Because this wasn't about responding to Boebert. Not anymore. That fire was already burning itself out. This was about responding to the country. She tucked Harold's letter into her personal folder, not the one marked press or floor remarks or policy briefs. This folder had no label, just a single sticker on its spine that said, North Star. That night she sat at her desk alone, a stack of unopened letters beside her, a dim lamp casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The hum of the building at night, the elevator cables, the cleaning crews, the distant echo of a gavel from another late-night hearing, all blurred into white noise. She didn't need to scroll social media to know the story was still everywhere. The meme, the silence, the backlash. But here in the quiet, she held something stronger than trending hashtags. She held stories, she held truths. And somewhere, in the letter of a 75-year-old man who had served in one war and survived another at home, she had found the weight and worth of staying still. Elevator rides became shorter, more crowded, more telling. In one lift, 2 junior staffers from the Judiciary Committee whispered without looking up from their phones. She finally got caught, one murmured. The other didn't ask who she was. Everyone already knew. Boebert hadn't appeared on the floor in 2 days. Her hallway lights stayed off. Her staff moved quickly, eyes down, smiles rehearsed but brittle. There was talk of a radio interview that had been canceled, a cable appearance that fell through, a donor event in Phoenix that went silent. But the buzz wasn't just about her fall, it was about what filled the vacuum she left behind. AOC, and the fact that she still hadn't raised her voice. Inside her office, the conversation was shifting. Her team huddled late into the evening. Press leads, legislative aides, even a junior scheduler who rarely spoke unless prompted. The whiteboard had 3 columns: now, later, and never. Under now, someone had scribbled, "Press conference?" Mia, her communications director, was pacing with her tablet. "They're asking again. CNN, NPR, even BBC. They're offering full segments, not just clips. They want your voice." AOC sat back in her chair, not defensive, but thoughtful. Her fingers tapped slowly on the cover of Harold's letter, which still hadn't left her desk. "We don't chase the moment," she said. "We build one. But the headlines are burning themselves out," she interrupted gently. "Let them." The room was quiet for a moment. No one argued. They didn't need to. She wasn't dodging. She was choosing. Later that afternoon, she walked the basement corridor toward a budget subcommittee meeting. Alone. No cameras, no entourage. Just the fluorescent hum of hallway lights and the smell of decades-old paint. As she turned a corner, she passed a Republican aide she didn't recognize. Young, suited, clipboard in hand. He kept walking, then paused. He turned back and caught up with her in 3 steps, eyes low, voice quiet. "Congresswoman?" he said, just above a whisper. She stopped. "Yes?" He didn't introduce himself, just extended a folded piece of notepad paper, edges torn, writing slightly smudged. "For you. No one knows I gave it. Please don't tell." Then he was gone, disappearing into a side office before she could respond. She opened it as she walked. "Some of us, we heard it too. And we've heard it before. Thank you for not becoming what she was hoping you would." There was no signature. She folded it and slid it into the same folder as Harold's letter. In the coming days, she would receive more notes like that, anonymous, hushed, hand-delivered like secrets from inside a fortress. Some were from junior staff, some from senior policy advisors, even one from a House colleague who'd never spoken to her beyond Madam Chair. Inside those walls, people were listening, and some, just some, were beginning to admit what they'd long ignored. That what had been caught on that mic wasn't shocking because it was new. It was shocking because it was finally recorded. And AOC's refusal to scream back, it didn't weaken the moment, it made it undeniable. That evening, as the dome of the Capitol turned gold in the setting sun and the halls emptied of lobbyists and flashbulbs, AOC stood at her office window, watching the light fade. In her hand, the folded note from the Republican aide. She didn't speak. She didn't post. She just watched. Because sometimes the most powerful movement in Washington isn't a march. It's when the walls themselves start to shift. Outside in the hallway, murmurs ran like an undercurrent through the crowd. "She's coming today, right? She hasn't said anything for 5 days. She's got to speak. Boebert won't show, but AOC, everyone says she's going off." Cameras were already rolling. News networks had pre-cut lower thirds loaded and ready. AOC responds live. Livestream thumbnails showed a frozen image of her empty seat from the last session. Twitter had started counting down. Hashtag her turn was trending in tandem with hashtag McStillon. At 2:03 p.m., the chamber doors open. Not with drama, not with fanfare, just with intent. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered quietly, almost slowly, as if the gravity in the room had thickened. She wore a gray blazer, unbuttoned, a plain black blouse beneath, no pin, no lipstick. In her right hand, she carried a thin navy folder. In her left, a single folded sheet of off-white paper, creased once down the middle. She didn't scan the room or wave to the press. She didn't look for cameras. She moved straight down the aisle, heels muffled against the carpet, and took her seat as if it were any other day. But it wasn't. From her seat on the committee panel, Congressman Reeves squinted across the aisle, leaned into his mic as if preparing to intercept. Representative Monroe, seated 2 chairs down from AOC, shifted slightly, then stilled. Even the chairman paused longer than usual before tapping the gavel to call the hearing to order. The Committee on Homeland Security will now resume, he said. We welcome members and guests back to the chamber for our continued discussion on enforcement policy, border adjudication, and due process. But no one was listening to him. All eyes were on the folder and the letter. Mia, seated behind AOC in the staff row, caught a glimpse of it as AOC laid it across the table's polished surface. A name in block script, faint but clear. Harold L. Parker. There were no opening statements scheduled. But midway through the witness questioning, the chairman turned toward AOC's microphone, almost like an invitation passed wordlessly across party lines. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, he said, you had requested time to address the committee. She nodded once. No papers shuffled, no throat cleared, just her voice, calm, steady, unmistakably present. Yes, Mr. Chairman. She picked up the folded letter and looked at it for a beat. Then she said, before we talk about numbers and border walls and policy thresholds, I'd like to talk about a letter I received. From someone who served this country longer than I've been alive. No one moved. She held up the letter, not for the cameras, but for the room. He wrote, quote, I never expected to hear that from Congress, but I thank you for holding your peace. She paused, not for effect, but to let the weight land. I didn't hold my peace to win anything. I did it because when a microphone picks up words like the ones we heard, the last thing this country needs is more noise. What it needs is to listen. Behind her, a pen slipped from someone's hand and clattered softly to the floor. She continued, I'm not here to attack another member. The recording already did that. I'm here because what we heard last week wasn't a misstep. It wasn't an accident. It was a memory, one that too many Americans like Harold have spent their lives trying to forget. The gallery leaned forward, collectively holding its breath. I don't speak today to respond to her, she added without naming anyone. I speak because silence held long enough becomes consent, and I did not come to Congress to consent to the past. There was no applause. The chairman didn't intervene. The moment didn't ask for punctuation. It asked for reflection. She sat back, eyes steady, hands folded over the letter. And just like that, the floor was open again. AOC glanced down at the letter again, then folded it carefully and placed it back inside her folder. When she looked up, her gaze didn't scan for approval. It settled on no one and yet touched everyone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even clear her throat. Instead, with a breath as calm as her presence, she began. There's a phrase we've heard more times than we can count. Maybe you've heard it at school, or in a grocery store, or whispered under someone's breath in a place where you were supposed to belong. She paused, letting the silence lean forward. To those who say, go back to where you came from, she said, her voice steady. I say, I'm from the Bronx, and we're still here. A slight stir moved through the gallery. Not a reaction, but a reckoning. She continued, her tone unshaken. I was born in a zip code that still gets redlined. I grew up between train stations where people measure safety by how fast they walk. My mother cleaned homes for families who would never invite her to the dinner table. And my father, he died before he could see the daughter he raised sit in this seat. Her words weren't rehearsed. They were remembered. I stand here not to ask for pity, not to deliver a rebuke, but because when someone speaks into a microphone, accidentally or not, and says that people like me used to know their place, I need you to understand something. She looked directly at the dais. I do know my place. It's right here. The line didn't soar. It didn't need to. It settled in the air like a truth that had been waiting for its moment. She leaned slightly closer to the mic. You said it thinking no one would hear, but now they have. Not just the words, but who said them and what it meant. A breath passed between seconds. There are people watching this right now who've been told their whole lives to be quieter, to be more grateful, to not make things about race. People who've been asked to forget, to forgive, to sit still. She didn't break eye contact with the room. I'm not here to make anyone sit in shame, but I am here to make sure no one stands in denial. Behind her, a member of the press silently mouthed the phrase, that's the quote. AOC looked around the room, committee members, staffers, interns, eyes all fixed on her, and softened her tone even further. If we are going to legislate immigration, citizenship, who belongs and who doesn't, then we must be honest about the stories we tell ourselves. We must be brave enough to admit that the microphone caught more than a sentence. It caught a sentiment, one that still lives in too many halls and too many laws. She paused again, but it wasn't hesitation, it was invitation. I believe in this country, not because it has always been good to people like me, but because it still can be, if we're willing to hear ourselves, all of ourselves, even when the mic wasn't supposed to be on. Then she looked down, pressed her palms gently against the folder, and said one final line, not loudly but firmly, as if to mark a stone with truth. Because the mic didn't betray you? She looked up. You betrayed it. With that, she leaned back, her time finished. No cheers, no clapping, just silence. But this time, it was the kind of silence that felt earned. The kind that lingers not because there's nothing to say, but because everything important has already been said. And for the first time since the hearing began, even those who had come prepared to argue had nothing left to add. No outburst followed, no immediate rebuttals, just a stillness so complete that even the ever-buzzing gallery above seemed to hold its breath. The entire chamber had become a held note, vibrating quietly in the space between accusation and acknowledgement. A woman in the fourth row behind the witness table reached for a tissue without realizing it. An aide near the corner stopped typing mid-sentence, his fingers frozen just above the keys. The chairman, hands folded over his gavel, didn't speak. He simply looked down for a moment, as if bracing himself for something that, surprisingly, didn't come. There was no procedural protest, no performative coughing, no paper shuffling. Even from across the aisle, a few Republican members, typically quick to react, remained seated, eyes down. Congressman Reeves, who had once launched a tirade at AOC during a previous border security hearing, stared at the table before him, lips pressed in a thin line. He didn't look up. It was as if the room had agreed, all at once, that this was not a moment to counter, not a moment to politicize. It was a moment to absorb. The silence didn't last forever. It began, like most truth-driven movements do, from the back. A young staffer stood, quietly, without fanfare. She wasn't important enough to have a nameplate, but she was brave enough to be first. She placed her hand over her heart, not in performance, but in something like recognition. A man next to her rose a second later, older, grayer, a former Army colonel turned policy advisor. Then, 2 rows over, a woman in a blue dress stood. She had been clutching her phone the whole session, but now she slid it into her purse and straightened her back. One by one, the gallery followed. It wasn't loud. There were no cheers, just the creaking of benches and the quiet shuffle of feet standing tall. From the corner of the gallery, a reporter whispered to another, "Are they really doing this?" The reply came as a whisper too. "They already are." What began as a handful of people in the gallery rippled downward, onto the floor. A Democrat from Maryland rose first, followed by a Republican from Vermont whose career had been marked by quiet centrism and a distaste for grandstanding. Then Monroe, from 3 seats down, stood slowly, shoulders square, face unreadable. It wasn't a political moment, it was a human one. And finally the chairman stood, not to signal anything, not to reclaim order, but simply to join the gravity of the room. Across from AOC, the chair Boebert once occupied remained empty. The mic that had betrayed its bearer stood still, its red light long since dimmed. But the damage, or perhaps the revelation, had already been done. AOC did not stand to receive the moment. She remained seated, hands folded, eyes lowered, not in submission, but in solemnity. This wasn't her victory. It wasn't anyone's. It was what happens when a truth is no longer deniable, when the echo of a single sentence grows louder than the systems that tried to contain it. One GOP member, seated 2 chairs to her left, exhaled slowly and nodded. Not at her, not for the cameras, but inward, like a man who'd been holding something in for far too long. No resolutions were passed that day, no formal censures, no immediate policy votes, but something else shifted. Not in headlines, not in hashtags, but in the very posture of power. Because in that moment, the chamber didn't erupt, it stood. And that, more than any shouted condemnation, was the clearest sign that silence, when wielded with truth, can move even the most unmoved places. CNN led with, "She didn't fight fire with fire. She used water." The banner on their homepage showed a freeze frame of AOC mid-sentence. Hands still, voice calm, her eyes lit with resolve. Below it, an op-ed titled "The Power of Not Shouting" by veteran journalist Dana Miles opened with a sentence few thought they'd read in a mainstream publication. "If dignity had a sound, we heard it yesterday." MSNBC followed suit, calling her speech a moment that quieted the noise of an entire chamber, and maybe, just maybe, the nation. Joy Reid replayed the clip, this time not with added analysis, but with 10 seconds of silence after it aired. Just stillness, so the audience could sit in what they just heard. But what surprised even the seasoned producers wasn't the progressive press. It was the places where the tone changed that no one expected. In Ohio, on a conservative-leaning AM radio talk show, a 67-year-old woman named Dolores called in and said, "I didn't vote for her. I never even liked her. But what she did? That was grown woman courage." In Iowa, a retired dairy farmer named Carl wrote a letter to his local paper. "We've had too much yelling, too much fighting. She didn't do either, and somehow, she won." The shift wasn't seismic. It was granular. It came in editorials, call-ins, and quiet retractions. It came in tone more than language. Words like measured, presidential, mature began to circle AOC's name in places where she'd once been dismissed as impulsive, emotional, or too young. Meanwhile, Lauren Boebert's numbers plummeted. A flash poll conducted by Western Strategies showed her favorability among registered Republicans had dropped 17 points in 3 days. Among independents over 50, the slide was steeper, 26 points. A majority of respondents who'd previously called her authentic now selected reckless. Conservative editorial boards scrambled. The Denver Sentinel published a rare rebuke. "Our Congresswoman must remember, volume is not valor. Rhetoric has consequences, and microphones always have memory." Even the National Review, typically a firewall against progressive praise, published a carefully worded column titled "When Silence Wins." It didn't endorse AOC, but it acknowledged something unexpected. Whether you support her or not, it is increasingly clear. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez understands the temperature of the room better than many of her colleagues, and perhaps that's what leadership requires most. The momentum wasn't just media-driven, it was generational. Older voters, those who had watched civil rights clashes unfold on black and white televisions, those who had heard too many promises shattered by noise, began speaking up. On a syndicated public radio show in North Carolina, a caller choked up as he said, "I'm 81. I remember Selma. I remember the dogs. And I remember what it means when someone holds their dignity in the middle of ugliness. That girl, she reminded me what courage sounds like." The clip went viral. Again, this time not on TikTok or meme pages, but through group texts, forwarded emails, shared Facebook posts from friends whose politics didn't usually bend in AOC's direction. Even the White House press office issued a subtle nod. In a morning briefing, Press Secretary Marisol Hayes said, "The president watched the clip. He believes in civil discourse. He believes the mic didn't lie, and neither did she." By the end of the day, one thing had become clear. AOC hadn't just won the moment. She had shifted the conversation. And in Washington, that's something even power can't always buy. It was just past 7 p.m. The sun had dipped low behind the Capitol dome, casting long amber streaks across the office floor. A desk lamp threw a gentle pool of light over the scattered folders, notebooks, and legal briefs. Somewhere behind the closed door, staff were packing up, whispering softly, giving her space. She had a stack of unopened mail in front of her, some typed, most handwritten, bundled together with a red rubber band. She wasn't ready to read them all. Not yet. She didn't have the strength to absorb more pain, or praise, or outrage. Not tonight. But one envelope caught her eye. It was small, not regulation-sized, Lined paper peeked out from the top, folded into a rectangle by hands clearly not used to writing letters. Her name was written in pencil, block letters, no return address. She opened it slowly. The note inside read, "Dear Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, my name is Maya. I'm in 7th grade. We watched your speech in class today because our teacher said it was important. At first, I didn't get it. Everyone was talking about the other lady and the mic and what she said. But then we listened to you, and it was different. My teacher always says that bravery means yelling when something's wrong. But you didn't yell, and I think you were the bravest person in the room." That was all. Just a few lines. A child's handwriting. The kind of message that doesn't go viral, doesn't trend, doesn't need to. She read it twice, then a third time, and something in her chest, tightened and stretched for days, finally broke, not with a sob, not with collapse, but with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes welled. She didn't cry from pride. There had been enough of that. It wasn't validation she needed. It was the moment of connection, the realization that someone had understood. Not a network, not a strategist, not a party. A child. A child had seen the moment for what it was, not as performance, not as power, but as courage. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that waits, that holds, that endures. She folded the letter carefully, her fingers moving slower than usual. She reached for the same folder where Harold's note lived, where the anonymous aide's words had gone, and tucked Maya's letter inside. 3 notes, 3 people. 3 voices that hadn't been on camera, but had seen everything. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, the lines of it disappearing into shadow. Outside the window, the streetlights buzzed to life. A siren wailed far in the distance, swallowed quickly by city noise. But in her office, there was only stillness. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and whispered to no one in particular, "Bravery doesn't need volume." Then she smiled, just barely. Not for the cameras, not for the news, just for herself. Because in that small envelope, in that pencil-written note from a 7th grader, she had found something she hadn't expected. Permission to feel tired, and a reason to keep going anyway. Inside, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained seated at her desk, not because there was work left to do, but because there was something unfinished. Not in legislation or polling or media cycles, but in spirit. She opened the drawer to her right and pulled out a deep burgundy folder, its leather surface worn along the edges. No label, no tags. Just a single strip of masking tape across the spine, on which a word had been written in faded black marker. Legacy. It wasn't a term she threw around lightly. It wasn't filled with awards or clippings or framed photos. It was something more private. A quiet collection of moments that had shaped her, challenged her, or reminded her why she ever picked up a microphone in the first place. Inside were only a handful of items: a photo from her first campaign office, a torn page from a college notebook with her original congressional announcement speech scribbled in pencil, a printed screenshot of her first viral floor speech with the caption, "She didn't blink," and now carefully she added 3 more pieces. First, Harold's letter, the veteran who remembered a time too similar to forget. Then the note from the unnamed Republican aide, folded once, edges slightly bent. Finally, Maya's words in pencil. "You were the bravest in the room." She smoothed them into place, aligning them not by size or order, but by weight. Closing the folder gently, she held it in both hands for a long, quiet moment. Her thumbs traced the word legacy on the tape, like it might press something deeper into her skin, something permanent. She looked out the window again. The street lamps flickered below. A lone cyclist drifted through the circle, wind in her hair, unaware she was being watched from the seat of power. And then, into the silence, not for effect, not for anyone to hear but herself, AOC whispered, "Mike's still on. Let's use it right." The phrase didn't carry like a declaration. It landed like a vow, a reminder that the words spoken into the world never really disappear. They echo, they morph, they land in classrooms and courtrooms, in break rooms and family dinners, and sometimes, if said clearly enough, in hearts. She stood slowly, placing the folder back in its drawer, turning the lock with a soft click. Not to hide it, but to honor it. As she gathered her coat from the back of her chair and shut off the desk lamp, the room fell into shadows, the kind that don't conceal but protect. She stepped out into the hallway, her heels gentle against the floor. The corridor was empty, and for once she welcomed the solitude. There were no interviews waiting, no debates queued, no fires demanding her words. Just the next day, and a microphone that would always be listening. 3 town halls in Colorado's 3rd District had been postponed. A keynote appearance at a Second Amendment forum in Nevada was quietly pulled from the agenda. A Fox News primetime interview slot that had once been her weekly pulpit was suddenly handed to someone else. No explanation offered. Inside her D.C. office, the lights remained dim for the 3rd consecutive day. Staff came and went in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact in the hallways. A few aides had already started taking personal calls in the break room, resumes being dusted off, LinkedIn profiles being updated. They knew what was coming, or at least what might. The rumors came in waves. She's considering resigning. She might not run again. She's going to take a strategic pause. No one could confirm it, but no one could dismiss it either. And then the headlines began to shift, from outrage to consequence. Boebert's future in question, Politico, fall from firebrand to liability, The Hill, even the right is turning. See, today in conservative talk radio, where she had once been a darling, hosts now stumbled over their words. I'm not saying she meant it that way, one began, but in politics, perception is reality, and this one's a tough sell. Even more telling were the silences. Congressmen who once amplified her every tweet now offered vague responses when asked about her. I don't speak for her. No comment. We're focused on the policy, not personality. Allies began to vanish, not with a bang, but with a polite unfollow. Tucker Carlson, who once called her the gutsiest woman in Washington, aired a segment that danced around the controversy before concluding, "Some people mistake provocation for principle. They're not the same." For Boebert, the isolation set in slowly, like a tide drawing back from the shore. Each canceled interview, each closed door, each sideways glance became a reminder, not just of the mic that betrayed her, but of the people who once cheered, now stepping quietly away. She didn't post much. A cryptic quote here, a Bible verse there. Nothing that addressed the storm, nothing that acknowledged the silence. And maybe that was the loudest part, because for someone who had built a brand on being loud, unapologetic, unfiltered, this quiet was more telling than any speech. It wasn't surrender, but it wasn't strength either. It was retreat. No camera crews followed her here. No press releases announced her visit. She had come alone. No staffers, no handlers, not even her usual body language of performance. Just a plain gray coat over a modest dress and eyes that refused to meet anyone else's for too long. The church was simple. Wooden beams, worn hymnals, sunlight streaking through stained glass that depicted not saints or battles, but wheat fields and mountain peaks. There were fewer than 50 people in attendance, most of them older, scattered in quiet rows like seeds in a long field. The sermon was gentle, focused on humility. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, not as a political gesture, but as a process that begins when someone admits they were wrong, even if the world never hears it. Boebert didn't move. She sat still the entire time, hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles ached. After the service, she waited until the room had mostly emptied, then quietly approached the pastor, a tall man in his 60s with weathered hands and kind, unflinching eyes. He recognized her, of course, but said nothing until she spoke. "Can we talk?" He nodded and led her to a small office tucked behind the choir loft. The room smelled of paper and cedar. On the wall was a framed photo of the pastor's father holding a shovel instead of a Bible. Boebert sat down, suddenly unsure of what she'd come to say. She spoke haltingly, avoiding the actual quote. She talked about pressure, bias, media traps, about how people don't understand the heat of Washington. She said she felt misrepresented. She said she hadn't been given the benefit of the doubt. The pastor listened without interrupting. Then quietly he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Lauren," he said gently. You didn't get caught saying something no one's ever thought. She stiffened slightly. You got caught saying what too many still believe? The room went still. He didn't speak it with judgment, but neither did he offer her a shield. What you said, it came from somewhere, not just your mouth, somewhere older, deeper, maybe handed to you, maybe never questioned. But now it's out, and it's yours. She looked down at her hands. For the first time in weeks, there was no comeback ready, no defense script spinning. He let the silence stretch. Then he asked simply, "What will you do with that truth?" She didn't answer, because for the first time since the mic stayed on, the question wasn't how to survive the fallout. It was how to face what had been revealed. No press conference, no surprise interview, no stage-crafted apology with flags in the background. For someone who had made a career out of being visible, loud, sharp, unfiltered, Lauren Boebert's absence became its own kind of statement. Capitol Hill noticed. Her seat on the Oversight Committee remained vacant. Hearings came and went with her name unspoken, her face missing from C-SPAN frames she once dominated. No substitute filled her chair. It simply sat there, unclaimed, unneeded. In that time, the news cycle moved on. Other controversies flared. Another vote loomed. But still, the memory of her words, 7 of them spoken into a live mic, lingered like smoke after the fire's been put out. Her team released nothing official at first. Only silence. And silence, as it turned out, was not a shield. But then, just as people began to speculate that she might resign, one message emerged. A statement, not shouted from a podium or threaded through a tweet storm. Just a single paragraph posted to her official website, buried beneath scheduling notices and contact forms. It read, "Sometimes the mic teaches us who we really are. And if we're listening closely, it might even show us who we've become." There was no direct reference to what she said, no apology, no call for unity. Just those 2 sentences, quiet, ambiguous, and yet undeniably human. Pundits pounced. Some mocked it as deflection. Others called it cowardice in poetic form. A few noted it as the first time she had ever released a statement without finger-pointing. But in corners of the internet, less political and more personal, the response was different. One user wrote, "I don't forgive her." But that line? That's the closest she's come to admitting she crossed one too many lines. Another said simply, "It's too late, but it's something." And maybe that was the point. It wasn't a redemption arc. It wasn't designed to salvage a career. It was what happens when someone reaches the edge of their own echo chamber and finally hears the reverberation coming back at them. Inside the Capitol, her colleagues didn't comment, but her absence had already altered the rhythm of committee sessions. Conversations were quieter, exchanges sharper, but less cruel. Even those who had once applauded her interruptions now chose their words with more care. The mic had taught more than just her. When Boebert finally returned, 23 days after her last appearance, she walked through the same marble corridor, past the same photographers, wearing the same fire-red blazer. But her eyes were different, not defeated, not defiant, just quieter. And in a town built on voices, that change spoke louder than anyone expected. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, casting horizontal lines across rows of senior students. Room 312, Roosevelt High School, somewhere in Ohio. American government, second period. A Friday before spring break. Most students were thinking about weekend plans until the screen came alive. C-SPAN footage. The congressional chamber, AOC standing still, a folded letter in hand. Mr. Jennings, their teacher, paused the video right before she spoke. "Now," he said, turning to the room, "just listen. Don't react, not yet." The play button clicked again, and the voice returned. A calm one, precise, unapologetic. "To those who say, 'Go back to where you came from,' I say, 'I'm from the Bronx, and we're still here.'" No one coughed. No one scrolled. Not even Ethan in the back, who was known for checking out mentally by second period. When the clip ended, silence lingered. Jennings leaned against his desk, arms crossed, letting the room breathe. Finally, a student, Maya, spoke first. "She didn't yell," she said, her voice almost uncertain. "She just stood there, and it landed harder than anything else." That's power I didn't know existed, added Darius, a normally quiet athlete in the corner. Like real power, not just noise. Another student chimed in. It's like she waited for everyone else to run out of steam, and then, boom, one line. That's it. Jennings nodded slowly. Why do you think it worked? A pause. Because, said Maya again. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just was. Like the mic was hers and she didn't need to raise it. Someone snorted softly, not mockingly, just in realization. She won without shouting, Darius repeated, this time more certain. And that makes every other time someone did shout feel small. Jennings let the discussion unfold, guiding but never steering. They talked about leadership, tone, representation, even the role of silence in a world addicted to noise. For once, nobody mentioned test scores or college essays. The learning felt real. As the bell rang, the students filed out, slower than usual. A few lingered to take photos of the board where Jennings had written, "Sometimes the mic teaches us who we really are." Later that day, he'd get an email from a parent asking for the video link. My daughter came home and said, "Now I get why you vote, Mom." That was the line. And in that moment, far from the Capitol, far from cable news panels and party lines, the echo of a congressional hearing reshaped something subtle, but lasting. Not with fury, not with fanfare, but with the undeniable presence of a voice that never needed to be raised to be heard. It wasn't the chandeliers or the high-profile attendees that kept the energy taut. It was the empty podium at the center of the stage. Everyone knew who was about to speak, but no one knew what she would say. AOC stepped forward, wearing no bold colors, no firebrand slogans, just navy slacks and a soft blouse. The hush that fell over the room was instinctive, not forced, not demanded, earned. She smiled briefly, hands resting lightly on the podium. "I've been called many things in my time," she began, her voice calm, unhurried. "But today, I want to talk about something more permanent than praise or insult." She paused, not theatrically, but thoughtfully. "I want to talk about what stays when the noise fades, about what's still left standing when the lights go off. I want to talk about legacy, not the kind they print in headlines, but the kind you build in layers." The audience leaned in, not moving, not blinking. "You don't win by being the loudest in the room," she said, eyes sweeping across the faces before her. "You win by being the last one still telling the truth." A soft ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. "You win by choosing calm when you're expected to explode. You win by speaking facts when they toss insults. And sometimes you win, simply by staying." A few heads nodded, a few eyes glistened. Legacy is not made of sound bites. It's made of moments we could have shouted, but didn't. When we let our integrity speak for us. When we chose principle over performance. The applause didn't burst. It rose, slowly, like something dawning. AOC closed her binder, but didn't step away just yet. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd ever stand in rooms like this. I grew up thinking I had to speak twice as loud to be heard half as far. And yet, here we are. Heard not because we shouted, but because the mic never turned off. We kept speaking, and the world finally leaned in." The standing ovation this time wasn't political. It wasn't viral. It was personal. Clips from the speech hit social media within minutes. On TikTok, a Gen Z creator layered the line, "You win by being the last one still telling the truth," over a montage of women from protests to classrooms. On Facebook, a veterans group shared it with the caption, "Leadership we recognize, even in silence." CNN played the speech 3 times in one day. But it wasn't news anymore. It was reflection. She didn't change the world that day, but she reminded it. And sometimes that's what lasts the longest. The Capitol stood hushed beneath a lavender sky, its white dome tinted gold by the setting sun. Inside, the long marble corridors were nearly empty, save for the quiet steps of one woman. AOC walked without an entourage, without cameras, just a slim folder tucked under her arm. She paused briefly at a shelf tucked behind a column in her office. A shelf not for show, but for memory. Carefully, she slid the folder into place. Its label read, "The Moment They Heard." She stepped back. No dramatics. Just breathe. Outside, the last sliver of light slipped below the horizon. This story reminds us that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet commitment to dignity and truth that leaves the deepest impact. AOC's restraint wasn't weakness. It was a strategic, powerful choice that reshaped the moment. In an age of noise, silence with purpose can be revolutionary. Question for you. Have you ever seen someone stay calm in the face of injustice and change everything because of it? What did that moment teach you? While this story draws inspiration from public discourse, all characters, events, and dialogues, including those attributed to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, are entirely fictional. This dramatization is a work of creative expression intended to explore ideas, not document reality. Thank you for taking the time to journey with us through this layered story of power, silence, and truth. If this resonated with you, even just one line, we invite you to subscribe to Alexandria Rising. More stories await, more questions to ask, and more voices, real or imagined, that still deserve to be heard. Let's rise together.